Hey folks, it's your old pal King Waspinator. Welcome back to Total Party Skills. There's been a little bit of backlash to some DM advice that is found in Dungeons & Dragons' latest introductory adventure module, which I'm sure you've probably heard of by now. This is like not fresh breaking news that I'm reacting to. It's been several days since this started to circulate. But the basic gist is if you find that your players are having trouble with the fight and are in danger of losing, start handing out advantage on their rolls like candy to make sure that none of the player characters die. This is the sort of thing one does if your primary goal is to, maintain some sort of narrative within the story structure of the adventure. But it's bad advice because an introductory adventure needs to teach people how to play, whether or not it's for new players. You could be playing with a bunch of experienced D&D players in their 40s, but if they've never played with you before, and you're going to run an adventure for them, that adventure, that initial starting point for the campaign needs to teach them how to play your game. You need to use it to set up what their expectations are, how they're supposed to behave, how the world around them is going to react to their decisions and choices. Part of the reason why older versions of D&D relied so much on the grind of early level play, where you have characters with next to no hit points that die real easily, and they're just being chucked one after the other down into the cave to fight that Goblin King so you can get that treasure. That's a teaching method, because people are stubborn, and a lot of players, especially noobs, have this recurrent problem where you have them encounter something in the adventure, and they throw themselves at it and refuse to stop attacking until they've been destroyed by it. Having players lose a couple of characters in a row and start to get frustrated is the sort of thing that will finally break them of that stubborn, I can take on whatever's in front of me kind of thinking, to get them to start planning ahead, worrying about hiring hirelings, understanding that it's possible to retreat, or maybe you could have tried talking to these things or threatening them or something instead of immediately coming to blows, that there are other options that they could have explored, so that they can then finally make a character that can get through that cave and kill that Goblin King, or negotiate with that Goblin King to steal and or receive that treasure. One could try to blame this phenomenon on challenge ratings as they were introduced around 4th edition and in 5th edition, creating this effect where the player characters are always scaled to whatever it is that they're facing. But I believe it predates that by quite a few decades. In some ways, it might be something that's more the result of video games. When you're playing video games, you kind of start to be trained to feel that the thing that you're facing in the level, even if it's a boss at the end and it's hard, it's still something that's appropriate to the power scale of the level you're currently on, which challenge ratings certainly reinforces in the modern versions of Dungeons & Dragons and other games that use challenge ratings. But it creates this false sense of security in the player of assuming that everything that they face in the environment is something that's suitable for them to go up in combat against. And when in reality, no, there should be plenty of things they run into that are way over their power grade until they get to a much higher level. And the whole thing needs to be written and structured in such a way that they are taught how to interact with that thing without getting themselves killed, and also to teach new DMs how to balance how they operate these powerful things. The big dragon might not just be automatically triggered to kill on sight any player characters that enter their den. Maybe it'll want to be like Smaug and talk with them a little bit and toy with them and see what's up with them, maybe before striking, giving the characters some breathing room to figure out how to deal with this challenge without immediately throwing them into they're being hit by a cone of fire blast and all that kind of stuff. But these DM tips, as are apparently written in this new adventure module for 5.5, that doesn't really teach the players anything. It might help them teach the basic mechanics of the gameplay, which they would learn anyway in any combat scenario, whether they survive it or not. But it doesn't teach them to stop and consider what they're doing. It teaches them that, when things get tough, don't worry, we're going to bend things to make sure that you succeed no matter what, which deflates the challenge and therefore some of the fun of these things. You could just go play a video game by yourself on journalist mode and not have a bad time. What makes D&D or any role-playing game a game and not just a bunch of people sitting around imagining together is that there are structures and rules and stakes. There are limitations on what the player characters are capable of doing and how well they're able to do it. And if you remove failure from that process from them, then none of those limitations actually mean anything, and it stops just being a game. Instead, it's just a bunch of people sitting around fantasizing with each other. Which, I mean, sure, but that doesn't necessarily justify the need for buying all the books and DM shields and player cards and spell tablets and dice and maps and all the other accoutrements, not to mention all the books and source books and second edition books and source books for those second edition books and ad infinitum. Not that whole industry wouldn't exist if all it was just people just making shit up off the top of their heads sitting around a table together for some reason. No. In order for it to be a game, it has to have structure and limitations. And in order for those limitations to have any sort of reality, those limitations have to be able to bite back. And that means that failure is a thing that can occur. And while failure doesn't always necessarily have to be a lethal scenario in a role-playing game, when characters are faced with combat, the threat of imminent demise does, need to be there. Otherwise, why even bother with the combat scene? You just have the characters go drink tea at a Starbucks or something. Combat, especially for beginning level type role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons, is featured because part of what role-playing games are is you're presenting players with a scenario that they have to think their character through and make a bunch of decisions, make use of the rules, roll some dice, and have some sort of established tension in order for the game to function, and have any sort of cathartic effect. Combat simplifies all of that. You can establish all those things with other kinds of scenes and other types of roleplay, but combat makes a nice shorthand. The stakes are imminent. You don't want your character to get killed by this goblin in the cave. It gives you options. Every time it's your turn, you can choose exactly, do you want your character to move? Do you want your character to go do something to try to set up advantage for next round or to help another player character? Do you want them to rush in and to attack? Do they want to switch out their weapons with a different kind of attack? Do they want to use a spell? All the permutations of what kinds of different spells and spell magic there are. There's a lot of options, and by choosing these options, the player then gets to interact with the rules of the game by rolling dice and checking out their stats on their character sheet to see whether or not they succeed or fail. And the tension is there by the presence of the hit points, this little number that keeps getting whittled down closer and closer to zero. And they don't want it to hit zero. And so every time they lose a couple of numbers off that hit point pool, it was at 12 hit points, but now it's at 10. That ranks up the tension. And yes, getting their character killed might make that tension pop. But it also means that after they've rolled up a new character and they're playing again next time and they get into combat, they know that, oh shit, I gotta think about what I'm doing carefully, or I'm gonna have to make up another goddamn character again and have to come up with some excuse to get introduced to the group and then argue about whether or not I get to keep my experience points that I had earned last time because I don't want to be 3 levels behind everyone else in the group, and so on and so forth. There are consequences that will weigh in the player's mind and make them hesitate and think about what they're doing in various situations. And combat is a great way to introduce that dynamic. It conveys a lot of the rules systems that go into a role-playing game. And from there, you can bridge off into trying to learn as a DM how to create that sort of tension and choice dynamic and other kinds of scenes. Social scenes are all well and good if you just want to sit around and make up dialogue amongst each other. But if there's some sort of tension to that social scene, and the characters have to actively choose and think about how they're negotiating through that social scene instead of just reacting to things as they're said, then that becomes role play again. So on and so forth. Don't buy this D&D adventure that I wasn't going to buy and look at anyway. Hearing that they're sticking this sort of stuff in it is not surprising. It certainly goes along with the trend of the video gamification of D&D that's been going on for a decade now. Plus, I remember when I first played 4th edition D&D, and it very much is like, I feel like I'm playing an analog video game, except all this stuff that's normally hidden behind the screen is now stuff I'm having to think about, and that's not fun. 5th edition seemingly opened that back up to a more free, expressive type of role-playing game that isn't always wedded to what the characters are doing on a map at every moment. But there's a point where you shove yourself so far off of that internal grid map of interaction, and it stops being a game. Then you're just role-playing, but you're not necessarily playing a role-playing game. So that's it. Until next time, stay waspinated. And oh, while I still have you here, if you're looking for more of a tongue-in-cheek version of the Star Trek stereotype, might I suggest We Want Soviet Men, where you can play as comrades on your comrade starship exploring the stars. It's a sourcebook for Escape from Planet Matriarchy, the very first original Total Party System rulebook, where players take on the roles of 20th century astronauts who are shot 500 years into the future to crash land on the moon of Titan to discover the nightmare society that has evolved there, both of which can be found in the Vintage Future RPG, available now on Amazon.com in print or drive through RPG for a PDF.